So thank you guys at Samvaad for calling me over. You know, you'll keep hearing a lot about defense and foreign policy. Is it going right? Is it going wrong? And I usually tailor my speeches depending on the audience. So because this was an IIT audience, I wanted to come from the view of first principles and maybe give you a set of principles that you can apply generally when you're thinking about things like defense and foreign policy. And I also decided to make it a bit of a reality check because very frequently we hear, you know, we're going to indigenize, we're going to become a superpower, so on and so forth. So I wanted to sort of break down the elements of indigenization, superpower, and all of that. And let's take a look at foreign policy because foreign policy, the main core doctrine behind our foreign policy, as well as our defense policy, which is indigenization, lies, the root of it lies this one word, strategic autonomy. How many of you, show of hands, have heard of strategic autonomy being used? Nobody's heard of strategic autonomy? God, typical IIT. Guys, get into politics, yo. But strategic autonomy is the core function, right? It gives us, apparently, it gives us the freedom to do what we want to do, when we want to do, without being beholden to anybody else. Now, and I apologize to the cameraman if I'm making you move around a bit too much. I'm just more comfortable walking around and looking at you. What are the elements of strategic autonomy? Now, let me tell you in practical terms what strategic autonomy means. Tomorrow, if we want to go, say, I don't know, bomb Sri Lanka, we should be able to do it for whatever reason we deem fit in our national interest without worrying about anyone or anything else. Like, for example, during the Bangladesh Liberation War, we shouldn't worry about the US 7th Fleet coming and threatening us. So what are the elements that make a country strong enough to be strategically autonomous? And one of the reasons I want to take you down this path rather than the normal defense and foreign policy path is because, you know, I've been there and I've done that. I've done the micro of defense and the micro of foreign policy. And the question that kept arising was, we keep saying, you know, if only we got that right, if only we got that right. Our defense, you know, it's indigenous. It's all because of these dalals and international, arms sales agents that are undermining us. It's because of, the Western hatred for all brown people and all non-white races that we're being subjugated and all of that. And, you know, that's fine as rhetoric. But then I think, was it Albert Einstein who said that if you keep doing the same thing over and over again and end up getting the exact same results, then, you know, and expect a different result, that's one of the definitions of madness. So that was the thing, and that was one of the reasons I decided to expand this talk onto the broader social issues that affect defense and foreign policy. Social issues like, for example, well, not exactly social, but things like the economy, all right? Things like the state of knowledge in this country, the quality of knowledge in this country, energy. A lot of you might not realize this, but our energy supply and what we do and deal with it is a very, very important indicator of if we can become strategically autonomous, because one element of strategic autonomy is energy security, right? But as you'll see, it also works in a demand and supply angle. Next is food and health. Now, you might not realize this, but in a Western country, for example, when somebody is training to become an Air Force pilot or the captain of a ship, the basic level of education that he or she is given is at a much, much higher level. The human investment that has gone into them is at a much, much higher level than it is in India. And again, I'll be demonstrating how that all works in. Water, excuse the typo, just water, it shouldn't be energy. But these are some of the topics that we'll be looking at, which you won't hear in a discussion that is related to defense and foreign policy. Now, why is all of this important? Because if you look at this, this is all domestic policy I'm talking about. There's nothing foreign policy. I mean, there's very little foreign policy about all of this. It's because there is no such thing as foreign policy. A country's foreign policy is usually domestic interests and domestic policies that's projected abroad, what you perceive as your interest, which is fundamentally a function of domestic policy. So let's look at this now. To truly understand this, I'll have to give you a very, very quick history lesson. But this is basically the different stages of human evolution. I mean, the important ones, there's micro divisions and things like that in there. But if you look at the general characteristics, Stone Age, all right, one of the things you see is illiteracy, because writing, reading, not invented at this phase. We're looking at about 7,000 BC-ish and before. Extremely high levels of societal violence. How many have you read Voltaire and Rousseau and all those people? Anyone? You know, he came up with this concept of the noble savage, which was, you know, in our purest state without social conditioning and all of that, a human being is fundamentally very good. He's noble. He or she is noble at heart, and they do all the right things. You know, this greed doesn't exist, theft doesn't exist, crime doesn't exist, rape doesn't exist. And we know for a fact now that that is complete and utter rubbish, because Stone Age societies have some of the highest levels of societal violence you can possibly imagine. You have death rates of up to 25%. Now you come to the modern age, for example, even with World War I and II combined, you're still struggling to get a death rate of 25% of population when you look compared to the Stone Age. There are very complex sociological reasons behind this. We'll discuss that during the Q&A if you want to. Cannibalism, another extremely common thing, because you never know where your next meal is going to come from. There is no morality in that sense. There is no sometimes there isn't even religion. We don't know at what point in the Stone Age religion develops. Things like that. Then you get to the Bronze Age, and Bronze Age is clearly systematic of a civilization. Now there is a fallacy in this which I'll point out later, but in the Bronze Age, you still have high levels of illiteracy. We actually have some Bronze Age civilizations where literacy was a very elite concept, right? You have the centralization of power, because that is what happens in empire. You have significantly, well, not significantly, but you have much reduced societal violence. And you generally, sometimes you can have cannibalism, but mostly you move from cannibalism towards human sacrifice. All right? And again, we can talk about all of this. There's hard historical examples for this. Then you come to the Iron Age, and there again you can see literacy, centralization, much reduced societal violence, the end of human sacrifice in some societies, not in all. China and India are classic examples where it did not end with the Iron Age, but Europe is a classic example where it did. But what you see is the emergence of mob violence, which is very important in terms of the lynching debates and all of that you hear right now. But again, those are complex sociological issues that I'll go into later. Then we get to the Industrial Age. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but the Industrial Age technically starts with the Coal Age, which is sometime in the 1600s with this engine that was meant to take out, it was coal miners in Britain to take out water from the pits that were accumulating, right? And that is where you move. Now, in military terms, this chemical revolution started much earlier. It started with gunpowder. It started with the introduction of gunpowder, where when you were besieging ports and things like that, it was no longer just plain mechanical energy. It was chemical energy being used. And it had disproportionate effects. But for it to translate into economic terms, it took a much longer time. And that is where the Industrial Age starts in 1600. Now, there is correlation, but there is not causation to why each of these, and it's very tough to say, are these symptoms of this age or are they causes of the age? It's very tough to say, but there's hard sociological, there's a high level of correlation to this. But the most important thing about the Industrial Age is that the state starts acquiring a monopoly on violence. Does everybody understand the monopoly on violence? Yes? Everybody? Does anybody not understand it? Put your hand up. Okay, so the state's monopoly on violence is that you industrialize to a sufficient point where you can police everybody. The level of state control is so great that you police everybody, Everybody is scared of the consequences of being caught. And therefore, it is the state and state alone that uses violence. You can't have mob violence anymore. Whereas you look at the Iron Age, you look at the pogroms in Europe, the anti-Jewish pogroms, things like that that used to happen. They all start reducing very significantly. The wars of religion in Europe in the 1600s, they all start reducing after all of this, right? And finally, there's several stages in the industrial age. The coal, then the petroleum, then you have the digital age, and then you finally have the information age. They're all very nuanced and separate. And finally, we get to the information age. Now, the information age is the biggest disruptor in this chain of things, because what you see is it's based on universal literacy, hence information. You have decentralization. Remember, to industrialize, you need an extremely high level of centralization. Industrialization cannot happen without centralization. You need strong governments for industrialization because, as we will discuss later, there is huge social upheaval. To go from an agricultural lifestyle to an industrial lifestyle is a very, very difficult thing. To give up your notion of ownership, which revolves around land, to give up your notion of income that involves 2 or 3 crops a year, to a monthly income, to savings, to being in a house, to not owning things. It's, I know it sounds very easy right now, but psychologically when you see it, and again we can discuss, and I never understood it. I mean, I read about it, but I never understood it till I went to Papua New Guinea and Brazil to see the Amazonian tribes. But then I'll explain it to you. I don't know if you'll understand it because it's one of those epiphany eureka moments. And you know, you get to, now the belief is that this is the end of mob violence, but no, it isn't. What you see here, if you notice here, is state monopoly on violence here. All right, mob violence is mostly controlled, which happened in the previous generation. But then you have a different form of mob violence that comes about because of decentralization. Remember that, that's a very important point. Again, we can talk about it at a later, during the Q&A or even during the speech itself. And the different forms of mob violence you see are, for example, like troll attacks on Twitter. That's a form of mob violence in a sense. You have several social movements which are ostracism. He said that that is politically incorrect. He should be kicked out of his job, which is no different than, say, 13th, 14th century Europe, where he blasphemed God, therefore he must be kicked out of his position and tried and so on and so forth. So you're actually seeing a lot of trends that indicate that you're returning to some form of Iron Age, medieval age morality. Just keep this at the back of your mind. I don't want you to dwell on this too much. Then let's look at economic history. Now there's a hard physics angle to this, right? Before, in the age of mechanical energy, everything was based on what the sun radiated down to Earth plus latent energy on Earth, and you had the total energy, you can't create. It's basically the sum total always remains the same. Then you had the chemical revolutions that we spoke about this. But then what I want to show you is industrialization. In the period of heavy industry, like I said, you have strong states. But when you're looking at social decentralization, what you also see is the focus, it shifts from the large scale sector to the small, medium, and micros. All right. That is where all the critical innovation happens today. Let me give you a simple example. Has everyone heard of Boeing? Has everyone flown in a Boeing aircraft sometime or the other, or even Airbus? Till the 60s or 70s, Boeing used to manufacture almost 85 to 90% of its aircraft in-house. Today, the latest Boeing airliner, the 787, guess how much of it is manufactured in-house in Boeing? Any ideas? Anyone? About 12%. In America itself would only be about 30%. The remaining 70% comes from a globalized supply chain. All right? So that is one of the main things. So when you're talking about indigenization and self-reliance, there itself, you're looking at a different paradigm of industrialization altogether. Indigenization and modernization in the information age can't go hand in hand. Again, keep this at the back of your mind. Now, one of the things that everybody says, now how many of you believe that India is going to the next big superpower? Superpower India. Superpower India. Yay. Superpower. Who? Okay, great. This speech is all going to be about why it's not going to be a superpower, not in my lifetime and possibly not in your lifetime either. Now, one of the things we always say is we've got a very developed economy. Because if you look at it, the manufacturing and service profile of the economy is almost the same as Germany. Now, when you look at it, basically, it is true, right? Industry, 31% in Germany, 23% in, excuse me, 23% in India, services 68%, services 61%. What's different here? Agriculture and the agricultural per capita income. So, agriculture is 14% of your economy, of your GDP, but it's 47% of your workforce. All right? 47%. There, it's 0.7 and it's 11% of your workforce. But, very important out here, there's also a dependency ratio. Again, I'm not getting into the nuances and all of that. But here's the thing, an average German agriculturalist, and this is a clear sign of productivity. The average German agriculturalist makes $16,700 per capita. The average Indian agriculturalist makes $1,500 per capita. That itself should tell you a lot in terms of productivity. Next, in terms of population, now I've coined this term Westosphere. Now remember how we were talking about Boeing and the globalized supply chain of everything? How 70% of it comes from that. That remaining 70% comes from the Westosphere, overwhelmingly from the Westosphere. And what is the Westosphere? It's basically North America minus Mexico, I guess. North America plus Western Europe plus Japan, Australia, Korea. Basically all the OECD developed countries. Let's just call it the Westosphere here, right? What's the population there? 1.1 billion. Very similar to India, again very similar to China. So you'd think that all the indicators are kind of here, right? Again, what was the jarring factor in the last one? Agricultural income. Here population is the same, therefore market size is the same. It should happen, right? Demand supply. Everybody knows demand supply here? Yeah, okay. And surprisingly, it isn't. Why? Because here's your per capita income. Your Westosphere is at 43,000 US dollars, all right? Your per capita income of India is at about 2,000. It's slightly less, but about 2,000. China is about 11,000. All right. So what does this mean in market share terms? The size of the market. That's what you're looking at. All right. This is a fundamental problem. This is your first trap. When you say India superpower, India starts indigenizing. India starts having an independent foreign policy. You want to have the same independent foreign policy that China has with a market share that much bigger than yours. You want to have the same pull and the same kind of industry and the same kind of industrial sophistication that a market that is that much bigger than yours has. Clearly something's got to give out here because things aren't adding up. All right. Next. These are some figures I want you to go over. This, we're getting to knowledge. Now, what feeds an industrial ecosystem if we're in the information age? Because all of this, like we discussed, is the small, micro, medium sector, where innovation is very rapid. It's very quick. Today, innovation cycles. You remember when the ambassador came out? Does anyone okay, I'm old, but you guys are probably younger, so you remember the ambassador. You remember how unchanged the ambassador was for almost 40 years? When the initial ambassador came out looking like that, 40 years, no change. Today, in the space of 10 years, I remember the first iPhone 1 that I had looked very, very different from this. The processing power I have today in my phone. In 1980, the only man that had this level of communication and processing power was the President of the United States of America, and it took that entire jumbo jet called Air Force One to cram in this level of power into this one phone. Literally. Communications and all, command, control, all of that, right? So the driver of all of this has been knowledge, all right? It's that because phones change so quickly, therefore, it's you understand synergy? Synergy is basically where 2 + 2 = 5 or 6 rather than 4. It's these little things that keep adding up that matter in the end. Now, to feed that, you need a knowledge force. because this is all about people. Industrialization isn't machines. It's all people building machines and things like that. So now look at this chart. This is the second trap that we're talking about. 13 million. That is the number of people joining the workforce in India every single year. All right. Now, many people have said that this report is gross exaggeration and la-di-da. Now, even if you take 1/10 of this figure, which is a gross underestimation, I'm going to go with this figure because it's been catalogued and this thing. I'm just throwing out 1/10 as a purely, as a mental exercise. But you look at this, 13 million people into 12 years of primary education and 3 years of a bachelor's degree or a trade degree, what we'd call an apprenticeship in Germany. That's 15 years into 13 million people per year is 195 million people. All right? That's your education burden that the government of India faces in one form or the other every single year. All right? Now, what do you need to train and understand? We're fundamentally an agricultural country. Like that slide we saw, 47% of us are agricultural. All right? 47% of the workforce is agricultural. Now, to make it a factory floor workforce, all right, there are a lot of studies done. You need at least $1,000 per annum invested in the education of the kid from the first standard to the 12th standard. All right? Which adds up to a total education budget per annum of $156 billion. All right. Now, to take it to the next level, which is you want to train them and skill them. All right. You're looking at least $10,000. We're not looking at an American Ivy League education of what, $70,000 a semester, $140,000 a year. We're not looking at a European trade education, which costs the government about $20,000 to $25,000 a year. We're looking at a basic entry-level education to be a factory floor worker, to be skilled so that your training it's the hidden cost passed on to your employer, the industrialist. To train you for that, just 3 years of education, 13 million per year, 3 into 13 into $10,000, $390 billion per year. You add the two up, $546 billion. That's more than your national budget today. On education alone, if you want to industrialize. All right. Now, $546 billion, how much do we actually spend on education? Government expenditure is $8 billion. Private education, who send their kids abroad or to non-government schools, colleges, and things like that, private universities, is another $8 billion. You're spending $16 billion as opposed to the primary requirement of entering an information age economy, which is $546 billion. Understand the differential there. All right? That's a very, very scary figure. All of you should be worried about that. It's not happening. So guess how much we end up spending per student per year overall? $82. Okay? So you're looking at industrialization. Our industry is the best in the world, sir. Our scientists are the best in the world, sir. At $82, they are not going to be the best in the world. All right? It is just sheer statistics that out of 1.2 billion people, you will have some very, very, very smart people who end up winning Nobel Prizes or going abroad and things like that. But remember, the Indian state had nothing to do with it. It was just their innate brilliance, why they went abroad and did all of that. Next. This is something that complicates your entire picture. Because even when you spend money, there is a food and nutrition aspect to it. 44% of people in India are malnourished. It's a very, very complex picture because there are things like, for example, the clash of modernity. Right? In the olden days, all you used to use your fuel in the chula in the house, you'd cook on a wood fire. And all you could do was you could just barely, you've done basic economics, so you know Giffen goods, inferior goods and things like that. So what happens there is all of it was spent on your major energy consumption, which was carbohydrates. And you had whatever little that was left for your vegetables and things like that, which would just be steamed. Now the good thing was, this was something that was in tune with nature. It gave you all the nutrients you wanted because it just barely steamed. It wasn't boiled the living daylights out of. It wasn't Punjabized with, butter and cream and garam masala and onion, tomato and ginger paste and everything, to the point where everything is just calorie. There's no taste. There's no nutrition, nothing left. You've pressure cooked all the vitamins, all the nutrients out of it. You might as well just wash it and, just be eating the fiber that's left over in those vegetables. But that is one of the reasons of malnutrition, but this is a very complex picture. But remember, 44% are malnourished. 38% are stunted. Do you know why that's an important figure? Does anyone do health economics, anyone? No? Okay. 38% stunted is very, very important, because what happens with stunting is it also restricts your mental functioning. All right? Because the human body is programmed that when you have high protein, it grows. Your brain is all fat and protein, right? It needs that to fuel the thinking process and all of that. When you don't, the problem is your reduced cognitive abilities you can't then start feeding people. All right? Even if you feed people, it takes almost 3 generations for those same mental faculties to recoup. So even if you're spending $1,000 per capita per kid on education, it's not enough. They need supplementary care like a special needs child would, almost, in that sense. All right? So your outlay increases that much. Imagine 38%. Imagine of 195 million people, 38%. I don't even know what the cost of special education is, but that is your necessity at the moment. And you might not even realize this, but stunting, it was with me my entire life in India, and I never realized it till I went to North Korea. In North Korea, we went to, like good troopers, we went to lay wreaths at, Kim Jong-un and Kim Il-sung's mummified body. And when we were coming back, I saw a delegation of what I thought was midgets. I literally thought they were midgets. They were like 4 foot nothing, 4 feet 3 inches, something like that. And you're like, midgets. They're not midgets. You've all heard of the North Korean famines? Yeah, that happened. These were people that had grown up at that point of time, and their growth had been stunted by a full 1 to 1.5 feet compared to a normal human being. They were built like bulls, because what happened was that there was a emergency program to feed them soy milk, which was a very good form of protein supplement. So they were built well, but heavily stunted to 1.5 feet. And these people all came from Hamgyong province. Hamgyong province, the famine was different. It wasn't because of human management. It was collective punishment, because Hamgyong was deemed to be a rebellious province. Why? Because they had started privatization and they were selling their own vegetables instead of selling it to the state. So they were punished. Almost 1 million of them died in this one province, and entire lives ruined, the future ruined because of that. Now, you might not realize this, but how many of you have noticed landless laborers who come and work at construction sites? In Delhi, there's construction all over. But notice, when they come from these areas like Jharkhand, Bihar, and some of those what used to be called Bimaru states, you'll notice the height difference between you. It's almost 1.5 feet. How do you account for such severe differences across the board in certain areas? This is the effects of stunting. Now, it's very easy to dismiss early on, but think about it. Next, that's your third trap, by the way, education and malnourishment. Malnourishment complicates the trap. Energy, water, and food. 30%, 60%, 40%. Does anyone know what those figures represent? Energy loss, water loss, food loss. Energy loss due to theft and transmission losses. 30% of your generated energy is lost. 60% of your water is lost. And now there's figures that say 37%, 60%, is a documented figure. I don't know, but even if it's 37%, it's too much. 40% of your food that you produce. Remember that 47% of your population that accounts for 14% of your GDP, 40% of that is lost, wasted GDP, unproductive, useless GDP. All right. That energy loss of 30% translates into 16.8 billion US dollars every single year. The government spends $16.8 billion, which just never see the light of day. They're just lost. All right, no productive use, it's just lost. China has brought down the cost of a nuclear reactor very similar to the French reactors we're installing to about $2.75 billion. All right. Now that translates $2.75 billion reactors for about 2,000 megawatts, so 2 gigawatts, I guess, equals 6 nuclear reactors lost every year. You could have installed 6 nuclear reactors every single year with that money lost. And that's, well, it's 12, it's not 12,000 gigawatts, sorry, it's 12,000 megawatts of energy, of installed capacity, installed energy capacity that you have lost every single year. Now understand from the first few slides, low income, all right, your education problem, almost unsurmountable statistics that we're talking about, compounded by this kind of criminal wastage. All right? 3 billion units of energy wasted in a single day, some wasted every year in traffic jams. That's one whole day worth of full installed power capacity being lost. Again, wastage. 50% of India live in near drought conditions. 33% live in severe drought conditions. 50% live in near drought conditions. And this is coming to the next thing, water. You've all been hearing about the pollution problems in Delhi where I come from? Yeah? Okay. The total GDP of rice in this country is about $43 billion. All right? Now, assume that 40% is wasted out of that. You come down to $26 billion. Now, chasing those $26 billion worth of internal revenue and export revenue, you are endangering the lives of $167 billion worth of highly productive people, 73 million people in the Delhi metropolitan area. This is a policy problem. Because when you say pro-farmer, pro-poor and all of that, you're basically saying that the people who grow this $26 billion are more important to you. You're willing to risk the people who create that $167 billion worth of wealth. This is your next trap. How are you going to break this cycle? Then, why are we not able to break this cycle? And that's because of representational problems. Do you understand the difference between a democracy and a republic? Everyone? Shall I do a quick, who needs a quick explainer? Okay. A democracy is basically like ancient Greece or the Mahajanapadas. Every issue you have, you put it to a vote. I don't like that computer out there. IIT should change that computer. Let's have a referendum on it and let's get rid of it. All right. In a sense, it's almost mob rule in a sense, right? A republic is where you elect people over a period of time to take a longer term view and they do the voting for you. So it's a mediated democracy in a sense. What is a mediated democracy? So how was our democracy mediated? In 1947, right, when we got independence, till about 52 when our constitution, 50-52 when our constitution was formed and then embryonic, 10% of your population was urban, 90% was rural. So the mediation in India, in America, because it was kind of 50-50, it was 50% of the power was given to the urban areas, 50% given to the rural areas. In India, it's different. 90% of the voting power was given to the rural areas. The rural areas basically drove your policy agenda. The economic power was given to the cities. All right, if you wanted to be rich and things like that, you came to the cities. In 2017, that's changed. 65% is now urban, 35% is rural. And now take that 65% very loosely because it includes things like peri-urban areas, right? So if you go to, say, Meerut or Dhanbad and, you know, where the sugar mills are and things like that, you're like, dude, a lot of it is classified as rural and you look at it, there's nothing even remotely rural. So we get out of it claiming it's peri-urban. No other country really uses it, but we use it. But say 65% is basically an urban lifestyle. 35% is rural. Now, that 10% in 1947 had about 40 seats in the Lok Sabha. Today, urban areas get between 150 to 200 seats depending on whose calculation you go by. But understand this. Does this have a laser pointer at all? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, much better. So remember, 10% had 40 seats. Now 65% have 200 seats, which means 343 seats are controlled. The vast majority, almost a 2/3 majority, are controlled by 35% of the population. Do you know any other country that had the same setup? Anyone? Apartheid South Africa. 20% of the population controlled the vast majority of resources, the political power. In a sense, what you're seeing is rural apartheid. And I use that word very measuredly. But it is rural apartheid. When 35% of your population effectively controls 343 seats, then you're going to have a problem. So when you see all of Modi's, these farm policies and la-di-da giving, loan waivers, electricity waivers, whatnot, this is the driving factor. It's not economics, it's basic, cold electoral politics, which is actually economically very, very detrimental. All right. This is why a lot of the problems we spoke about earlier can't get fixed. Now, what's happened between 1947 and, does anyone know what happened? The 600 to 700 million has been the rural to urban migration. Does anyone know why that happened, when that happened? The 1991 reforms. The majority of it happened at that time, right? It created so many jobs and things in the urban areas. That's when the thing happened. Now the problem was, you remember I said that 10% had the economic power, whereas the 90% had the voting power. That 10% that lived in the cities, today Delhi's metropolitan area has a population of 73 million. In those days growing up in Delhi, it used to be 4.5 to 5 million. All right, nothing much. But the thing was, you had the best institutes. It was all meant to be quality, quality, quality. It wasn't meant to be quantity. When you have two different economic systems, a rural economic system that is quantity geared, and an urban economic system that is quality geared, and then you have 700 million people suddenly crowd an urban economic and education system, quality isn't going to work, which accounts for the deterioration of education quality standards in India. I'm going to be very rude here since this is an IIT and tell you, do you know how many IITs figure in the top 500 list of universal top universities? I'm not going to say it, you figure it out yourselves. I'm rude, I'm not that rude. Next issue, you remember we spoke about the state monopoly on violence. Now why is it important? Today, so in medieval Europe, in Iron Age Europe, in the 14th, 15th centuries, if you've read the 30 Years' War, the 100 Years' War, you'd literally have bands of mercenaries and troops going around terrorizing people, extracting, wealth from them. And this was the reason. Have you ever heard of this thing, Ram Rajya, the righteous caliphs? Common themes, Jesus will come, things like that. Always looking back past at a golden age. You always say the golden age was in the past. Why? Because life in medieval Europe and India, everywhere during the medieval period was so bad, you imagined the only way you could survive was imagine a past that was better. And you always want to get back to it. All right? It's actually a psychologically proven this thing. Now, law and order, what it does, now you may think it's a very bad thing. Because, the general discourse today is policemen are bad, kill all the cops. I mean, you've seen all those crazy lefty videos coming out of America, right? Antifa and things like that who want to kill every cop they come across and so on and so forth. That's actually complete hogwash. Because security is the second basis of which everything, including economic security, happens. You can set up a business, you're not worried mercenaries are going to come burn your foundry down or your business down or extort you and things like that. So law and order is one of the most important things. And yet, look at the figures even in law and order. This is your fifth trap, I think. Fifth, or is it sixth? I don't know. Anyway, fifth or sixth trap. Germany. There's one cop per every 268 people. Very peaceful society. One cop per 268 people and a crime rate of 34.6. India, one cop per 690 people. Now imagine we have this, and again we'll talk about these figures a bit differently. One cop per 690 people, much, much more violent country, societally violent country than Germany is. China, a much more peaceful country, still has one cop per 700, which is the same as India. All right? Look at these figures. Now, then look at these figures. These are the general crime rates. What do you see is the problem with this crime rate? Anybody who's gone to Germany will tell you that it's far, far less crime than you come across in India. A lot of it is a statistical problem, and that's the crime variation. So, you know, the highest rape rate in the world is in South Africa. But guess who the second highest rape rate in the world is? Sweden. All right, paragon of liberal European socialist democracy, Sweden, of political correctness, of female equality and empowerment, Sweden has the second highest rape rate in the world. Well, did for, I think it's third or fourth now, but it was second for a long time. Do you know why? Because of reporting problems. In South Africa, a rape isn't actually considered a rape. Till there is actual grievous, violent harm inflicted on the woman, it doesn't actually, the police won't even bother pursuing it. In Sweden, on the other hand, does anyone know why Julian Assange got arrested for rape, or at least he was wanted for rape in Sweden? Because he did not wear a condom. She asked him to wear a condom, he did not wear a condom, and that counted as rape. So understand, the reporting standards are so different. So this variation in crime doesn't even begin to explore how different that crime actually is. So societal crime in India is actually exponentially higher, and one of the manifestations of this is mob lynching, cow lynching. All right, it's classic cases of high societal crime in rural areas. Now there's other things that compound all of this. One of the things, you've all heard about the rule of law. Rule of law is after you've provided security, rule of law is the second most important thing. Because yes, tomorrow somebody can come and kill you in a medieval society, but then after security, what's the second thing that gets to you? That the ruler doesn't like it. He wants your monopoly on, say, rice or wheat or something. So he comes and tries to seize it from you. But then you have a judiciary that says, you know what, you can't take it from him. It's his property. Now in India, the second biggest problem and one of the highest risk, I do a lot of risk consultancy, and one of the highest, not one of, the highest allocation of political risk is to that, judicial capriciousness. We claim to have the rule of law, we do not have the rule of law in this country. The rule of law is a joke, right? Add to that, pendency. It's what, 35 million cases in pendency. And this is the number of judges per capita. For 35 million, you have 19 judges in India. Look how many judges Germany has. So you see this pattern of law and order? Very important in creating an industrial society. Monopoly on violence, the state of India does not have, because that's evidenced by mob lynchings and things like that. None of the features actually add up. So these are all the hard limits towards you industrializing and coming anywhere near that market size. All right? Because till you industrialize, you're basically not going there. So what do we deduce from all of this? All right. First is that you have a serious statistical collation problem. I can tell you at the last place I worked, we collected data from about 30 different government departments, which amazing data. They surveyed between 300 to 400, 300 to 600,000 families. And understand, when you know you have election predictions based on just 2,000 callers or sometimes even 200 callers, imagine how many people we're talking about. It's an extremely high fidelity survey rate. But none of these guys even wanted to use it. It was just lying around. We bought it for a pittance. It had all been coded in different language. So we had to spend a lot of money then collating the code. And in spite of that, we didn't actually have any usable data. So imagine how much money has gone in 30 different departments serving between 300 to 500,000 people. into that statistical collation problem. That policy in India has no correlation with the real problems. You see a lot of discussion of micro problems, you know. If only we had continued the contract with Messerschmitt, Brown, Boveri, or whatever, Messerschmitt, MBB, the Dhruv helicopter wouldn't be so crash prone. It would be better. Sorry, no. You're just not producing the kind of engineers you need. You're not investing enough in them when you do. Let me give you a simple example. When I was at Sandia National Laboratories, the University of Albuquerque, which is just close by. Now, Albuquerque isn't one of those first-tier universities, right? It's one of those third-tier universities. Do you have a nuclear reactor at IIT Kharagpur? No. University of Albuquerque does. All right? I'm a humanities student. I did economics and BCom. I go there and they actually let me do a experiment on their reactor. They won't let me do it because that counts as a nuclear non-proliferation treaty violation. I had to submit a proposal for a experiment, and they did it for me, which I observed. That's the amount they're willing to invest in a student. And that experiment would have cost something like about $100,000, but a student at the University of New Mexico, Albuquerque pays about per annum $20,000 to $25,000. So imagine the state is investing that much in you because they have, well, it's GIGO, you know, garbage in, garbage out, that entire analogy out there. Serious problems. Oops, sorry. Okay, next. Now that collation problem and things like that, those 6 traps we just spoke about, leads to policy formulation problems. Because when you base your thing on the fact that you are an advanced country, you can achieve anything without looking at the fundamentals, your industrial policy is going to be wrong. When your industrial policy is going to be wrong, your economic policy is going to be wrong. And when you misread your economic policy, fundamentally your defense and your foreign policy is going to be horribly wrong. All right? Now, one of the things you see, one of the ways this manifests is, India gets very petulant. You know, every time things don't go our way at an international forum, we start crying racism, this, that. New York Times is writing such bad things about us on Kashmir and on Article 370 and la-di-da-di-da. It all keeps coming down to that. You have a problem of expertise as well, right? You don't know how to deal with the situation because we haven't invested enough in you. I used to have people studying with me in Australia from the French diplomatic service. And every 6 months, they would be recalled to France to do a 3-week refresher course on things. The amount they used to spend on their diplomats was just ridiculous, just training them every single time, investing in them, even though they hadn't even joined the diplomatic corps at that point in time. So then you have policy expertise problems. You have law and order problems that we discussed, no state monopoly on violence. So we get to the next part, intelligence and defense. Where's the capacity? Where's the money? You demand all these sophisticated weapons. Where's the money? Where's the engineering workforce? How are you going to indigenize? Where is strategic autonomy? All right. Indian foreign policy then becomes a constant case of failure compensation. And then we actually believe that we can island problems. Now, this one isn't actually a deduction. This is a separate thing. You know what islanding is? It's basically creating a separate sector of your economy. You say, ki theek hai, we can't invest in making all these 195 million people. We can't afford $596 billion every year to invest. So we will choose certain 20 million very, very smart kids. We will invest in them and so on and so forth. It can't be done in a democracy because of those representational problems we spoke about. Where was it done? In South Africa, where the white population had complete resource capture. All right. So this is another problem that you're looking at. Sorry. So we end with this. Where is your strategic autonomy? All right. There is none. So the next time you hear a diplomat talking about strategic autonomy, try asking him any of these questions. See if she even knows about most of these problems. And I bet you the answer is going to be no. And I'd finally like to end with one, again, I'm sorry I'm being rude. I'm a rude kind of guy. You know, there was a Times of India, I think all the newspapers carried it, that 97% of engineers in India cannot problem solve. Did you read that? I wanted to put a screenshot of it. Yeah, you've seen it, right? Now, that's not the real problem. The problem is that the 97% think that they're the remaining 3%, which is not the case. So that's the end of the presentation. Questions?